Hi. I want to read to you from one of my favourite Pratchett books, and I'm sure you can see the cover, Weird Sisters, which covers three of my favourite things as written by Terry. Witches, fairy godmothers, and death, obviously. There was one ram-top witch who was not attending the Sabbat. Witches like a night out as much as anyone else, but in this case, she had a more pressing appointment, and it wasn't the kind of appointment you can put off easily. Desiderata Hollow was making her will. When Desiderata Hollow was a girl, her grandmother had given her 4 pieces of advice to guide her her young footsteps on the unexpectedly twisting pathway of life. They were: never trust a dog with orange eyebrows. Always get the young man's name and address. Never get between 2 mirrors. And always wear completely clean underwear every day, because you never knew when you were going to be knocked down and killed by a runaway horse, and if people found you had unsatisfactory underwear on, you would die of shame. And then Desiderata grew up to become a witch. And one of the minor benefits of being a witch is that you know exactly when you're going to die and can wear what underwear you like, which explains a lot about witches. That had been 80 years earlier, when the idea of knowing exactly when you were going to die had seemed quite attractive, because secretly, of course, you knew you were going to live forever. That was then. And this was now. Forever didn't seem to last as long these days as once it did. Another log crumbled to ash in the fireplace. Desiderata hadn't bothered to order any fuel for the winter. Not much point, really. And then, of course, there was this other thing. She'd wrapped it up carefully in a long, slim package. Now she folded up the letter, addressed it, and pushed it under the string. Job done. She looked up. Desiderata had been blind for 30 years, but this hadn't been a problem. She'd always been blessed, if that was the word, with second sight. So when the ordinary eyes gave out, you just trained yourself to see into the present, which anyway was easier than the future. And since the eyeball of the occult didn't depend on light, you saved on candles. There was always a silver lining, if you knew where to look, in a manner of speaking. There was a mirror on the wall in front of her. The face in it was not her own, which was round and pink. It was the face of a woman who was used to giving orders. Desiderata wasn't the sort to give orders, quite the reverse, in fact. The woman said, "You are dying, Desiderata." "I am that too." "You've grown old." "Your sort always do. Your power is nearly gone." "That's a fact, Lilith," said Desiderata, mildly. "So your protection is withdrawing from her?" "Afraid so," said Desiderata. "So now it's just me and the evil swamp woman, and I will win." "That's how it seems, I'm afraid." "You should have found a successor." "Never had the time. I'm not the planning sort, you know." The face in the mirror got closer, as if the figure had moved a little nearer to its side of the mirror. "You've lost, Desiderata Hollow." "So it goes." Desiderata got to her feet a little unsteadily and picked up a cloth. The figure seemed to be getting angry. It clearly felt that people who had lost ought to look downcast, and not as if they were enjoying a joke at your expense. "Don't you understand what losing means?" "Some people are very clear about that," said Desiderata. "Goodbye, my lady." She hung the cloth over the mirror. There was an angry intake of breath, and then silence. Desiderata stood, as if lost in thought. Then she raised her head and said, "Kettle boiled just now. Would you like a cup of tea?" "No, thank you," said a voice right behind her. "How long have you been waiting?" "Forever." "Not keeping you, am I?" "It's a quiet night." "I'm making a cup of tea. I think there's one biscuit left." "No, thank you." "Well, if you feel peckish, it's in the jar on the mantelpiece. That's genuine Clatchian pottery, you know. Made by a genuine Clatchian craftsman. From Clatch," she added. "Indeed?" "I used to get about a lot in my younger days." "Yes." "Great times." Desiderata poked the fire. "It was the job, you see. Of course, I expect it's very much the same for you." "Yes." "I never knew when I was going to be called out. Well, you'd know all about that, wouldn't you? Kitchens, mainly. It always seemed to be kitchens." She picked up the kettle and poured the boiling water into the teapot on the hearth. "Indeed?" "I used to grant their wishes." Death looked puzzled. "What, you mean like fitted cupboards, new sinks, that kind of thing?" No, the people." Desiderata sighed. "It's a big responsibility, fairy godmothering. Knowing when to stop, I mean. People whose wishes get granted often don't turn out to be very nice people. So should you give them what they want, or what they need?" Death nodded politely. From his point of view, people got what they were given. Okay, I've got to stop there. Good night, and if you have a spare moment this weekend, read the rest of this book. I hear it's quite good. Good night.
My reading is from Sourcery, which of all the books I'd love to see turn into a film, Sourcery would be it. It's got everything on an epic scale that I would love to see, and it pulls so much from fantasy cinema already. As we start our tale, our heroes, Konina, Nigel, Rincewind, and Creosote, are escaping the Ceres palace as it collapses. It's not important to know this, but they're riding a magic carpet. The palace was pulling itself to pieces, and the pieces were funneling up into the air like a volcanic eruption in reverse. The sorceress's tower had completely disappeared, but the stones were dancing towards the spot where it had stood, and "They're building another tower," said Nigel. "Out of my palace too," said Creosote. "That's one," said Rincewind. "That's why it's building its own tower. It's sort of a reaction. Wizards always used to build a tower around themselves, like those, what do you call those things that live at the bottom of rivers? Frogs? Stones? Unsuccessful gangsters? Caddisflies is what I meant," said Rincewind. "When a wizard set out to fight, the first thing he always did was build a tower." "Oh, it's very big," said Nigel. Rincewind nodded glumly. Now, at this point, our heroes escape the city and land upon a beach some miles away. They build a fire and catch some sleep in the hope that morning presents some fresh solutions. Konina woke up after midnight. There was a crescent moon on the horizon and a thin, chilly mist covered in the sand. Creosote was snoring on his back. Nigel, who was theoretically on guard, was sound asleep. Konina lay perfectly still, every sense seeking out the thing that had woken her. Finally, she heard it again. It was a tiny clinking noise, barely audible above the muted slurp of the sea. She got up and flicked Nigel's sword out of his unresisting hand. Then she sidled through the mist without causing so much as an extra swirl. The fire sank down further into its bed of ash. After a while, Konina came back and shook the other two awake. "I think you ought to see this," she hissed. "I think it could be important." "Oh, I just shut my eyes for a second," Nigel protested. "Oh, never mind about that. Come on." Creosote squinted around the impromptu campsite. "Where's that wizard fellow?" "You'll see, and don't make a noise. It could be dangerous." They stumbled after her, knee-deep in vapor, towards the sea. Eventually, Nigel said, "Why dangerous?" "Shh, did you hear it?" Nigel listened. "Like a sort of ringing noise. Watch." Rincewind walked jerkily up the beach, carrying a large round rock in both hands. He walked past them without a word, his eyes staring straight ahead. They followed him along the cold beach until he reached the bare area between the dunes, where he stopped and, still moving with all the grace of a close horse, dropped the rock. It made a clinking noise. There was a wide circle of other stones. Very few of them had actually stayed on top of one another. The three of them crouched down and watched him. "Is he asleep?" said Creosote. Kanina nodded. "What's he trying to do?" "I think he's trying to build a tower." Windswind lurched back into the ring of stones and, with great care, placed another rock on empty air. It fell down. "He's not very good at it, is he?" said Nigel. "Oh, it's very sad," said Creosote. "Maybe we ought to wake him up," said Kanina. "Only I heard if you wake up sleepwalkers, their legs fall off or something. What do you think?" "Could be risky with wizards," said Nigel. They tried to make themselves comfortable on the chilly sand. "Oh, it's rather pathetic, isn't it?" said Creosote. "It's not as if he's a proper wizard." Kanina and Nigel tried to avoid one another's gaze. Finally, the boy coughed and said, "I'm not exactly a barbarian hero, you know. You may have noticed." They watched the toiling figure of Rincewind for a while, and then Kanina said, "Well, if it comes to that, I think I lack a certain something when it comes to hairdressing." They both stared fixedly at the sleepwalker, busy with their own thoughts and red with mutual embarrassment. Creosote cleared his throat. "If it makes anyone feel better," he said, "I sometimes perceive that my poetry leaves a lot to be desired." Rincewind carefully tried to balance a large rock on a small pebble. It fell off, but he appeared to be happy with the result. "Speaking as a poet," said Kanina carefully, "what would you say about this situation?" Creosote shifted uneasily. "Funny old thing, life," he said. "Pretty apt." Nigel lay back and looked up at the hazy stars, then sat bolt upright. "Did you see that?" he demanded. "What?" "It was a sort of flash, a kind of..." The humbled horizon exploded into a silent flower of colour, which expanded rapidly through all the hues of conventional spectrum before flashing into brilliant octarine. It etched itself on their eyeballs before fading away. After a while, there was a distant rumble. "Some sort of magical weapon," said Kanina, blinking. A gust of warm wind picked up the mist and streamed it past them. "Blow this," said Nigel, getting to his feet. "I'm going to wake him up, even if it means we end up carrying him." He reached out for Rincewind's shoulder just as something went past very high overhead, making a noise like a flock of geese on nitrous oxide. It disappeared into the desert behind him. Then there was a sound that could have made false teeth on edge, a flash of green light, and a thump. "I'll wake him," said Kanina. "You get the carpet." She clambered over the ring of rocks and took the sleeping wizard gently by the arm, and this would have been a textbook way of waking a somnambulist if Rincewind hadn't dropped the rock he was carrying on his foot. He opened his eyes. "Where am I?" he said. "On a beach. You've been dreaming." And that is it for this evening. Thank you very much. That was my reading from Sourcery, one of my favourite Discworld books.
Thank you very much indeed, Daniel.
Hello, guys. So this is kind of unexpected. I wasn't really expecting to be reading this evening, but I'm so glad I am. I'm wearing my reading hat, and I'm going to be reading from the all-wonderful Good Omens, which I think you're seeing round the wrong way. Sorry about that. So I just love this book so much, always have done, but I particularly like all the children's dialogue. Anything that's got children's dialogue in it, I love. And in here, I can hear Billy Bunter and I can hear Just William just crying out to me. And these are books from my childhood. So I really hope you enjoy it. I know I'm going to absolutely love reading it. Okay. It jolly well isn't. It jolly well is. It isn't, you know. It jolly well is. It isn't so... Oh, right then. But what about volcanoes? Wensleydale sat back with a look of triumph on his face. "What about 'em?" said Adam. "All that lather
comes up from the centre of the earth where it's all hot, said Wensleydale. I saw a programme. It had David Attenborough, so it's true. Then the other them looked at Adam. It was like watching a tennis match. The hollow earth theory was not going over as well in the quarry. A beguiling idea that had stood up to the probings of such remarkable thinkers as Cyrus Reed Teed, Buller Lytton, and Adolf Hitler was bending dangerously in the wind of Wensleydale's searingly bespectacled logic. I didn't say it was hollow all the way through, said Adam. No one said it was hollow all the way through. It probably goes down miles and miles to make room for all the lather and the coal and the oil. Hello, someone's come in. Yes? Okay, and Tibetan tunnels and such like, but then it's hollow after that. Well, that's what people think. And there's a hole at the North Pole to let the air in. Well, I've never seen that on an atlas, sniffed Wensleydale. The government won't let them put them on a map in case people go there and have a look in, said Adam. The reason being that people living inside don't want people looking down on them all the time. What do you mean Tibetan tunnels, said Pepper. You said Tibetan tunnels. Oh, didn't I tell you about them? Three heads shook. It's amazing, you know. You know Tibet? They looked and nodded doubtfully. A series of images had risen in their collective minds. Yaks, Mount Everest, people called grasshopper, and little men sitting on mountains. Other people learning kung fu in ancient temples. And snow. Well, you know all those teachers that left Atlantis when it sunk? They nodded again. Well, some of them went to Tibet, and now they're running the world. They're called the Secret Masters, on account of them being teachers, I suppose. And they've got this secret underground city called Shambhala, and tunnels that go all over the world, so they know everything that goes on and they control everything. Some people reckon that they really live under the Gobi Desert, he added loftily, but most competent authors don't reckon it's Tibet all right. Better for tunnelling anyway. The them instinctively looked around at the grubby, dirt-covered chalk beneath their feet. How come you know everything, said Pepper. You just have to listen, right? Hazarded Adam. They just have to sit in their tunnels and they listen. You know what hearing teachers have? They can hear a whisper right across the room. My granny used to say, put a glass against the wall, said Brian. She said it was disgusting the way you could hear everything that went on next door. And those tunnels, they go everywhere, do they? Said Pepper, still staring at the ground. All over the world, Adam said firmly. Must have took a long time, said Pepper doubtfully. You remember when we tried digging that tunnel out in the field? We were at it all afternoon, and all you had to do was scrunch up to get in it. Yeah, but they've been doing it for millions of years. You could do really good tunnels if you've been doing it for millions of years. I thought the Tibetans were conquered by the Chinese, and the Dalai Lama had to go to India, said Wensleydale, but without much conviction. Wensleydale read his father's newspaper every evening, but the prosaic everydayness of the world always seemed to melt under the powerhouse of Adam's explanations. I bet they're down there now, said Adam, ignoring them. They'd be all over the place by now, sitting underground and listening. They looked at one another. If we dug down quickly, said Brian. Pepper, who was a lot quicker on the uptake, groaned. Oh, what did you have to go and say that for, said Adam. For a lot of good it's going to do is trying to surprise them now, isn't it? With you shouting about it like that. I was just thinking we could dig down, and you just had to go and warn them. Oh, I don't think they dug all those tunnels, said Wensleydale. It doesn't make any sense. Tibet's hundreds of miles away. Oh, yes, and I suppose you know more about it than Madame Blavatsky, sniffed Adam. Now, if I was a Tibetan, said Wensleydale in a reasonable tone of voice, I'd just dig straight down to the hollow bit in the middle, and then I'd run around the inside and dig right up where I wanted to be. This gave them due consideration. You've got to admit that's more sensible than tunnels, said Pepper. Yes, well, I expect that's what they do, said Adam. They'd be bound to have thought of something as simple as that. Brian stared dreamily at the sky while his finger probed the content of one ear. Funny, really, he said. You spend your whole life going to school and learning stuff, and they never tell you about stuff like the Bermuda Triangle and UFOs and all those old masters running around the inside of the earth. Why do we have to learn boring stuff when there's all this brilliant stuff we could be learning? That's what I want to know. There was a chorus of agreement. Then they went out and played Charles Fort and the Atlanteans versus the ancient masters of Tibet. But the Tibeters claimed that using ancient lasers was cheating. Thank you.
Okay, so I am reading from Wintersmith, and just a little bit, just because she's such a strong young lady. Her father's hand caught her chin and gently turned her head around. How soft his hands are, Tiffany thought. Big man's hands, but soft as a baby's because of the grease on the sheep's fleeces. We shouldn't have asked you, should we? He said. Yes, you should have asked me, Tiffany thought. The lambs are dying under the dreadful snow. And I should have said no. I should have said, I'm not that good yet. The lambs are dying under the dreadful snow. There will be other lambs, said her second thoughts. But these aren't those lambs, are they? These are the lambs that are dying here and now. And they're dying because I listened to my feet and dared to dance with the Wintersmith. I can do it, she said. Her father held her chin and stared into her eyes. You sure, Jigget? He said. It was the nickname her grandmother had had for her, Granny Aching, who never lost a lamb to the dreadful snow. He'd never used it before. Why had it risen up in his mind now? Yes, she pushed his hand away, broke his gaze before she burst into tears. I haven't told your mother this yet, said her father very slowly, as if the words required enormous care. But I can't find your brother. I think he was trying to help. Abe Swindle said he saw him with his little shovel. I'm sure he's all right, but keep an eye open for him, will you? He's got his red coat on. His face, with no expression at all, was heartbreaking to see. Little Wentworth, nearly 7 years old, always running after the men, always wanting to be one of them, always trying to help. How easily a small body could get overlooked. The snow was still coming fast. The horribly wrong snowflakes were white on her father's shoulders. It's these little things you remember when the bottom falls out of the world and you're falling. That wasn't just unfair, that was cruel. Remember the hat you wear. Remember the job that is in front of you. Balance. Balance is the thing. Hold balance in the center. Hold the balance. Tiffany extended her numb hands to the fire to draw out the warmth. Remember, don't let the fire go out, she said. I've got men bringing up wood from all over, said her father. I told them to bring all the coal from the forge too. It won't run out of feeding, I promise you. The flame danced and curved towards Tiffany's hands. The trick was to fold the heat somewhere close, draw it with you and balance. Forget everything else. I'll come with, her father began. No, watch the fire, Tiffany shouted, too loud, frantic with fear. You will do what I say. I am not your daughter today, her mind screamed. I am your witch. I will protect you. She turned before he could see her face and ran through the flakes along the track that had been cut towards the lower paddocks. The snow had been trodden down into a lumpy, hummocky path made slippery with fresh snow. Exhausted men with shovels pressed themselves into the snowbanks on either side rather than get in her way. She reached the wider area where other shepherds were digging into the wall of snow. It tumbled in lumps around them. Stop! Get back! Her voice shouted, while her mind wept. The men obeyed quickly. The mouth that had given that order had a pointy head above it. You didn't argue with that. Remember the heat, remember the heat. Balance, balance. This was witching cut to the bone. No toys, no wands, no boffo, no headology, no tricks. All that mattered was how good you were. But sometimes you had to trick yourself. She wasn't the summer lady, and she wasn't Granny Weatherwax. She needed to give herself all the help she could. She pulled the little silver horse out of her pocket. It was greasy and stained. She'd meant to clean it, but there had been no time. No time. Like a knight putting on his helmet, she fastened the silver chain around her neck. She should have practiced more. She should have listened to people. She should have listened to herself. She took a deep breath and held out her hands on either side of her, palms up. On her right hand, a white scar glowed. Thunder on my right hand, she said, lightning in my left hand, fire behind me, frost in front of me. She stepped forward until she was only a few inches away from the snowbank. She could feel its coldness already pulling the heat out of her. Well, so be it. She took a few deep breaths. This I choose to do. Frost to fire, she whispered. In the yard, the fire went white and roared like a furnace. The snow wall spluttered and then exploded into steam, sending chunks of snow into the air. Tiffany walked forward slowly. Snow pulled back from her hands like mist at sunrise. It melted in the heat of her, becoming a tunnel in the deep drift, fleeing from her, writhing around her in clouds of cold fog. Yes, she smiled desperately. It was true. If you had the perfect center, if you got your mind right, you could balance. In the middle of the seesaw is a place that never moves. Her boots squelched over warm water. There was fresh green grass under the snow because the awful storm had been so late in the year. She walked on, heading to where the lambing pens were buried. Her father stared at the fire. It was burning white hot, like a furnace eating through the wood as if driven by a gale. It was collapsing into ashes in front of his eyes. Water was pouring around Tiffany's boots. But don't think about it. Hold the balance. More heat, frost to fire. There was a bleat. Sheep could live under the snow at least for a while, but as Granny Aching used to say, when the gods made sheep, they must have left their brains in their other coat. Excuse me for a minute. In a panic, the sheep were always just an inch from panicking. They'd trample their own lambs. Now ewes and lambs appeared steaming and bewildered as the snow melted around them, as if they were sculptures left behind. Tiffany moved on, staring straight ahead of her, only just aware of the excited cries of the men behind her. They were following her, pulling the ewes free, cradling the lambs. Her father yelled at the other men. Some of them were hacking at a farm cart, throwing the wood down into the white hot flames. Others were dragging furniture up from the house. Wheels, tables, straw bales, chairs. The fire took everything, gulped it down and roared for more, and there wasn't any more. No red coat, no red coat. Balance, balance. Tiffany waded on, water and sheep pouring past her. The tunnel ceiling fell in a splashing, slithering of slush. She ignored it. Fresh snowflakes fell down through the hole and boiled in the air above her head. She ignored that too, and then ahead of her, a glimpse of red, frost to fire. The snow fled and there he was. She picked him up, held him close, sent some of her heat into him, felt him stir, whispered. It weighed at least 40 pounds, at least 40 pounds. He coughed and opened his eyes, tears falling like melting snow. She ran over to a shepherd and thrust the boy into his arms. Take him to his mother, do it now. The man grabbed the boy, ran, frightened by her fierceness. Today she was their witch. Tiffany turned back. There were more lambs to be saved. Her father's coat landed on the starving flames, glowed for a moment, then fell into grey ashes. The other men were ready. They grabbed the man as he went to jump after it and pulled him back, kicking and shouting. The flint cobbles had melted like butter. They spluttered for a moment, then froze. The fire went out. Tiffany Aching looked up into the eyes of the Wintersmith. And up on the roof of the cart shed, the small voice belonging to wee dangerous Spike said, "Ah, Crivens." And that's it. Thank you.
I am here. Look, I thought about reading something from Men at Arms, but we just did a Christmas story that Terry wrote for our July episode in the great tradition, Australian tradition of Christmas in July, or as perhaps we should say, Hog's Watch in Groon. So I thought I'd read a bit from Hogfather. I'm sure you all recognize the bit. It was a magnificent grotto this year, Vernon Crumley told himself. The staff had worked really hard. The Hogfather's sleigh was a work of art in itself, and the pigs looked really real and a wonderful shade of pink. The grotto took up nearly all of the first floor. One of the pixies had been disciplined for smoking behind the magic tinkling waterfall, and the clockwork dolls of all nations showing how we could all get along were a bit jerky and giving trouble. But all in all, he told himself, it was a display to delight the hearts of kiddies everywhere. The kiddies were queuing up with their parents and watching the display owlishly. And the money was coming in. Oh, how the money was coming in. So that the staff would not be tempted, Mr. Crumley had set up an arrangement of overhead wires across the ceilings of the store. In the middle of each floor was a cashier in a little cage. Staff took money from customers, put it in a little clockwork cable car, sent it whizzing overhead to the cashier, who'd make change and start it rattling back again. Thus, there was no possibility of temptation, and the little trolleys were shooting back and forth like fireworks. Mr. Crumley loved Hogswatch. It was for the kiddies, after all. He tucked his fingers in the pockets of his waistcoat and beamed. Everything going well, Miss Harding? Yes, Mr. Crumley, said the cashier meekly. Jolly good. He looked at the pile of coins. A bright little zigzag crackled off them and earthed itself on the metal grill. Mr. Crumley blinked. In front of him, sparks flashed off the steel rims of Miss Harding's spectacles. The grotto display changed. For just a fraction of a second, Mr. Crumley had the sensation of speed, as though what appeared had screeched to a halt, which was ridiculous. The 4 pink papier-mâché pigs exploded. A cardboard snout bounced off Mr. Crumley's head. There, sweating and grunting in the place where the little piggies had been, were... Well, he assumed they were pigs because hippopotamuses didn't have pointy ears and rings through their noses, but the creatures were huge and grey and bristly, and a cloud of acrid mist hung over each one. And they didn't look sweet. There was nothing charming about them. One turned to look at him with small red eyes and didn't go oink, which was the sound that Mr. Crumley, born and raised in the city, had always associated with pigs. It went, Aah! The sleigh had changed too. He'd been very pleased with that sleigh. It had delicate silver curly bits on it. He'd personally supervised the gluing on of every twinkling star, but the splendor of it was lying in glittering shards around a sledge that looked as though it had been built of crudely sawn tree trunks laid on 2 massive wooden runners. It looked ancient, and there were faces carved on the wood, nasty, crude, grinning faces that looked quite out of place. Parents were yelling and trying to pull their children away, but they weren't having much luck. The children were gravitating towards it like flies to jam. Mr. Crumley ran towards the terrible thing, waving his hand. Stop that! Stop that! He screamed. You'll frighten the kiddies! He heard a small boy behind him say, They've got tusks! Cool! His sister said, Hey, look, that one's doing a wee! A tremendous cloud of yellow steam arose. Look, it's going all the way to the stairs! All those who can't swim, hold on to the banisters! They eat you if you're bad, you know, said a small girl with obvious approval. All up, even the bones. They crunch them. Another older child opined, Don't be childish, they're not real. They just got a wizard to do the magic, or it's all done by clockwork. Everyone knows they're not really One of the boars turned to look at him. The boy moved behind his mother. Mr. Crumley, tears of anger streaming down his face, fought through the milling crowd until he reached the Hogfather's grotto. He grabbed a frightened pixie. It's the campaign for equal heights has done this, isn't it? He shouted. They're out to ruin me, and they're ruining it for all the kiddies. Look at all the lovely dolls. The pixie hesitated. Children were clustered around the pigs despite the continued efforts of their mothers. A small girl was giving one of them an orange. But the animated display of dolls of all nations was definitely in trouble. The music box underneath was still playing Wouldn't It Be Nice If Everyone Was Nice? But the rods that animated the figures had got twisted out of shape, so that the Clatchian boy was rhythmically hitting the Omnian girl over the head with his ceremonial spear, while the girl in the Gatian national costume was kicking a small Lamedosian druid repeatedly in the ear. A chorus of small children was cheering them on indiscriminately. There's more trouble in the grotto, Mr. Crump, the pixie began. A red and white figure pushed its way through the crush and rammed a false beard into Mr. Crumley's hands. That's it, said the old man in the Hogfather costume. I don't mind the smell of oranges and the damp trousers, but I ain't putting up with this. He stamped off through the queue. Mr. Crumley heard him add, and he's not even doing it right. Mr. Crumley forced his way onward. Someone was sitting in the big chair. There was a child on his knee. The figure was strange, It was definitely in something like a Hogfather costume, but Mr. Crumley's eye kept slipping. It wouldn't focus. It skidded away and tried to put the figure on the very edge of vision. It was like trying to look at your own ear. What's going on here? What's going on here? Crumley demanded. A hand took his shoulder firmly. He turned round and looked into the face of a grotto pixie. At least it was wearing the costume of a grotto pixie, although somewhat askew as if it had been put on in a hurry. Who are you? The pixie took the soggy cigarette end out of his mouth and leered at him. Call me Uncle Heavy, he said. You're not a pixie. Now I'm a fairy cobbler, mister. Behind Crumley, a voice said, And what do you want for Hogswatch, small human? Mr. Crumley turned in horror. In front of, well, he had to think of it as the usurping Hogfather, was a small child of indeterminate sex who seemed to be mostly woolen bobble hat. Mr. Crumley knew how it was supposed to go. It was supposed to go like this. The child was always struck dumb, and the attendant mother would lean forward and catch the Hogfather's eye and say very pointedly in that voice adults use when they're conspiring against children, You want a baby Tinkler doll, don't you, Doreen? And the Just Like Mummy cookery set you've got in the window, and the cut-out kitchen range book. And what do you say? And the stunned child would murmur, and get given a balloon or an orange. This time, though, it didn't work like that. Mother got as far as, You want to, why are your hands on bits of string, child? The child looked down the length of its arms to the dangling mittens affixed to its sleeves. It held them up for inspection. Gloves, it said. I see. Very practical. Are you real? Said the bobble hat. What do you think? The bobble hat sniggered. I saw your piggy do a wee, it said, and implicit in the tone was the suggestion that this was unlikely to be dethroned as the most enthralling thing the bobble hat had ever seen. Oh, good. It had a great big, What do you want for Hogswatch? Said the Hogfather hurriedly. Mother took her economic cue again and said briskly, She wants it. The Hogfather snapped his fingers impatiently. The mother's mouth slammed shut. The child seemed to sense that there was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity here and spoke quickly. I want an army and a big castle with pointy bits, said the child, and a sword. What do you say? Prompted the Hogfather. A big sword, said the child after a pause for deep cogitation. That's right. Uncle Heavy nudged the Hogfather. They're supposed to thank you, he said. Are you sure? People usually don't. I mean, they thank the Hogfather, Albert hissed, which is you, right? Yes, of course. You're supposed to say thank you. Thank you. And be good. This is part of the arrangement. Yes. Then we have a contract. The Hogfather reached into his sack and produced a very large model castle with, as correctly interpreted, pointy blue cone roofs on turrets suitable for princesses to be locked in, a box of several hundred assorted knights and warriors, and a sword. It was 4 feet long and glinted along the blade. The mother took a deep breath. You can't give her that, she screamed. It's not safe. It's a sword, said the Hogfather. They're not meant to be safe. She's a child, shouted Crumley. It's educational. What if she cuts herself? That will be an important lesson, Uncle Heavy whispered urgently. Really? Oh, well, it's not for me to argue, I suppose. The blade went wooden. She doesn't want all that other stuff, said Doreen's mother in the face of previous testimony. She's a girl. Anyway, I can't afford big posh stuff like that. I thought I gave it away, said the Hogfather, sounding bewildered. You do? Said the mother. You do? Said Crumley, who'd been listening in horror. You don't? That's our merchandise. You can't give it away. Hogswatch isn't about giving it all away. I mean, yes, of course, things are given away. He corrected himself, aware that people were watching. But first they have to be bought, do you see? I mean, he laughed nervously, increasingly aware of the strangeness around him and the rangy look of Uncle Heavy. I mean, it's not that the toys are made by little elves at the hub. Damn right, said Uncle Heavy sagely. You'd have to be a maniac to even think of giving an elf a chisel, lest you want their initials carved on your forehead. You mean this is all free? Said Doreen's mother sharply, not to be budged from what she saw as the central point. Mr. Crumley looked helplessly at the toys. They certainly didn't look like any of his stock. And he tried hard to look at the new Hogfather. Every cell in his brain was telling him here was a fat, jolly man in a red and white suit. Well, nearly every cell. A few of the sparkier ones were saying that his eyes were reporting something else, but they couldn't agree on what. A couple had shut down completely. The words escaped through his teeth. It seems to be, he said. And that's that bit. Thank you.